Eye on the Storm, Hurricane Season 2019.
It's 8 o'clock on Wednesday night, and you know what that means. It's time for Eye on the Storm. Good evening and welcome to our show tonight. This is your weekly in-depth look at the tropics and how it will impact you. I'm CBS 17 Chief Meteorologist Wes Hohenstein here in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is week number 10 of our show, and we've got a good one for you tonight, as we'll be joined by meteorologists in Mississippi and Virginia as we take a look back 50 years ago at the destruction of Hurricane Camille, which not only devastated the Gulf Coast, I mean, it was bad down there, but it did a lot as it made a right turn over the mid-Atlantic. So we're going to look back in both spots and talk a lot about what happened some 50 years ago. Now, during tonight's show, if there's anything you would like to know, subjects you would like us to talk about tonight or in the coming weeks, remember, we're here throughout the entire hurricane season, drop us an email to sendit@cbs17.com. Our digital team is monitoring that email address, so let us hear from you. In the meantime, our panel tonight includes me. The best way to get in touch with all our meteorologists tonight is on Facebook. I'm Weather Wes Hohenstein, and I know Hohenstein's a mouthful, so just type in Weather Wes and it pops up, I promise. Ken South, he's got a much easier name to spell and pronounce. He can be found at Ken South WJTV on Facebook. And John Bernier up in Richmond, we talked to him earlier in the season. He's back with us. He's John Bernier, Weather and Wisdom. So one of the reasons we are talking about what happened 50 years ago with Camille is because there's not a whole lot going on right now in the tropics, and we're not complaining, but that's just the way things have shaken out right now. So this time of year, there's a few places we look, and here's a live look at the satellite. You can see in the Gulf of Mexico, I mean, there's a few thunderstorms. Those are actually related to a frontal system, typical daytime heating thunderstorm type stuff. Down in the Caribbean, I mean, hardly anything. Be a great time to go vacation down there. It's also at this point in the year that things start to get a little active way in the open waters of the Atlantic, also off the coast of Africa. I mean, there's barely any clouds, and I doubt any thunderstorm activity worth shaking a stick at, and that's very unusual. So much so that we found this statistic. The last time that the Atlantic went from July 15th, which was the last time we had really anything interesting to talk about, to August 19th, which kind of takes into account now and the next few days. So we're making a few assumptions over the next few days. But the last time the Atlantic went without any activity during that time of zero named storms was 1982. So it's been almost 40 years since we've had a period with this little of activity. So this is pretty unusual. One of the reasons why is because we've had a lot of Saharan dust coming off the coast of Africa. And that dust, remember, kind of hampers anything from developing. So let's look at both current and forecast Saharan dust. Again, this is important because the more of it there is, the more you see on this forecast map, the less chance there is of a thunderstorm developing, circulation forming, and a tropical storm or hurricane forming. So we go from our current conditions to through the weekend to through early next week, and look how much dust continues to get stirred up from the African continent on over to the Atlantic. So we see a period for the next several days, for the next week, as we're looking right now, where it's going to be hard for anything to form. And this time of year, that's where things really start to form. Early on in the season, we usually watch in the Gulf of Mexico, off the southeast coast, the western Caribbean. But your August formation spots, which are represented by dots here, this takes us all the way back to 1966. Each little dot represents either a tropical storm, a Category 1 or 2 hurricane, or a major hurricane. Look where most of the dots are. I don't want you to look at every single one. Look at where the cluster of dots is. It's out there in the open waters of the Atlantic. So if we've got too much Saharan dust, we're not going to get anything. And not that it's been a busy season so far. Remember, we've only checked 2 off the list, Andrea and Barry. Next up, Chantal, Dorian, Aaron, Fernand, and Gabrielle. So 2 down, and it's not too overwhelming, unusual that we've had that little activity, because as we look at the hurricane activity in a graph spread throughout the year, obviously the peak is yet to come. That happens in September, but we're just now really getting into the point where we would expect tropical activity to ramp up. Yes, I know I just showed you we haven't seen it yet, but the averages, the history tells us that this is the time the season really gets busy. And I'll finish with this before we get to our first guest. those of you who follow Dr. Rick Knabb on Twitter may have saw this earlier in the week, but he is the former director of the National Hurricane Center. He threw out a really interesting statistic, and it coincides with what we're about to talk about in 1969. A couple days ago, he said 50 years ago today, about 25 years into a previously active era, there had been one storm. So 50 years ago, there had only been one storm at this point, and weak El Nino was just ending. Well, guess what just happened to us? Weak El Nino has just ended, which is another reason why we might see more activity the rest of this season. But that's what happened 50 years ago. And then the Atlantic ramped up after that 50 years ago and had 18 storms, 12 hurricanes, 5 major hurricanes. So the same thing that's happening to us this year happened 50 years ago. They didn't have much activity. El Nino had ended. And then 18 storms, 12 hurricanes, 5 major. So what he was reminding us all, despite the fact that things have been calm up to this point, it could change in a very big way. So with that, I would like to welcome in our first guest tonight, coming to us from Mississippi. In fact, here's a live look at the Mississippi coastline in Biloxi. And is that me, or they got some rain? That is not a good day at the beach. But about 3 hours north of there is where our first guest is joining us from. So I'd like to welcome in WJTV Chief Meteorologist Ken South, who is in Jackson, Mississippi. And Ken, this is a big week, a big anniversary for the Gulf Coast, because it was 50 years ago in 1969 that Hurricane Camille slammed into the Mississippi coast. You guys have been covering a lot of that anniversary lately. Take us back 50 years and remind us what that storm did to Mississippi and the Gulf Coast.
Yeah, thank you, Wes. A pleasure to be with you on the show tonight. Yeah, it was, of course, a major storm. Really, Camille is a legendary storm, especially in the state of Mississippi, and for good reason. It was a monster hurricane. At the time, it was the second strongest hurricane in the Atlantic Basin and in the Gulf of Mexico. Just a monster Category 5 storm, and this is why it became such a big storm. This time of the year, it's pretty much a given that you're going to see very warm waters in the Gulf of Mexico. You really only need sea surface temperatures to be about 79, 80 degrees to fuel tropical development. Well, at this time of the year, of course, we're well past that. Right now, we've got those sea surface temperatures in the upper 80s, and you can imagine 50 years ago in August 1969, we probably had a similar situation. And of course, for explosive development of a major hurricane, you would also need low wind shear, or weak winds aloft, and well, that is exactly what happened with Camille. Now, Camille started as a tropical wave off the west coast of Africa back on the 5th day of August in 1969, but it really didn't develop into a tropical depression until it was in the Caribbean, just to the west of Jamaica. It formed on August the 13th. It became a tropical storm the next day on August the 14th, and then it really began to get stronger, becoming not only a Category 1, but a strong Category 2 hurricane as it clipped the western point of the country of Cuba. So almost a major hurricane at this point, almost a Category 3. That was on August the 15th, 1969. So after that, the forecast track of the storm was for it to go to the north and then turn to the northeast. They were expecting this to make landfall over the panhandle of Florida, but of course we all know that is not what happened. So the important point there is the folks along the Mississippi coastline in southeast Louisiana, they didn't have a lot of warning. They didn't have a lot of time to prepare for the storm as the forecast track changed. Now on August the 16th, the hurricane hunters out of Biloxi, Mississippi, they went in, investigated the storm, and discovered that it was a major Category 5 hurricane with 175 mile-per-hour winds, and it maintained that strength as it made landfall. Now, made a couple of different landfalls. At first, had to cross Plaquemine Parish in Louisiana, which is this parish right here. It's pretty much the mouth of the Mississippi River. That happened very late on Sunday night, August the 17th, but it actually didn't reach the Mississippi coastline until after midnight. So it was very early on Monday morning, even before the sun came up. And look at this. It came in 175 mile-per-hour winds, and the minimum central pressure was just 900 millibars, the second lowest ever of any landfalling hurricane in American history. And we actually have some video from 50 years ago. This is what it looked like even into the next day. There you see the winds really whipping up along the Mississippi coastline, and of course, tremendous storm surge and waves on top of that storm surge really inundating the entire Mississippi Gulf Coast. So it was just a horrible, horrible day for them. And of course, the aftermath was pretty bad as well. So let's go ahead and take a look back at the storm about where exactly it made landfall. This is Hancock County in Mississippi. Waveland, Mississippi is right about here. This is Bay St. Louis. So it pretty much made landfall right into this area. And all of the wind, the forward momentum of the storm, again, affecting the entire Mississippi coastline. We've only got 3 counties along our coastline. It's Hancock, Harrison, and Jackson counties. So, of course, the worst part of a landfalling hurricane is that northeastern quadrant where you get the highest storm surge and you get the potential for severe weather, and that is where Mississippi was. They were really in the crosshairs of this landfalling hurricane. And we also mentioned that 24-foot storm surge. Well, at the time, that was a record storm surge. Now, it was later surpassed by Hurricane Katrina with a 27-foot storm surge, which you can imagine the ocean rising 24 feet from sea level, and then the waves on top of that really inundating the entire coastline. Now, let's take a look at this in perspective. The only stronger landfalling hurricane before Camille, that was actually the Labor Day hurricane. I believe that was in September, early September 1935. That had a lower minimum pressure at 892 millibars. That moved through the Florida Keys. The other storms on this list here, Gilbert matching Camille, and then also Dean, both of these were actually Mexican storms. So Category 5 hurricane, we all know that is the strongest hurricane with maximum winds of 157 miles per hour. Of course, likely to produce catastrophic damage and, of course, power outages likely for months after a landfalling system like that. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the video of the aftermath of Camille as it moved inland, and take a look at the roads here. Now, this was just maybe a few days after the storm moved through. The roads were actually ripped up, and there weren't very many buildings actually left standing along the entire Mississippi coastline. There you can see some aerial footage right there of just how bad it was. We had storm surges that actually toppled 3-story buildings on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. So again, a completely devastating storm for the state of Mississippi. Wes?
Ken, I want to ask you, 50 years ago this week was August, and back then kids didn't go back to school until Labor Day, so you probably had still a lot of vacationers. And you guys have to deal with that today when storms come along. You got people on your beaches still on vacation, and they're on vacation, they don't want to leave. So, how do you think they dealt with it back then? Did they do it successfully? And then were lessons learned by the time Katrina came back around in 2005 and people did everything they were supposed to?
Yeah, honestly, probably not very well. Remember, the forecast track of the storm was to take it into the Florida Panhandle, so there really wasn't very much warning. Now, obviously, forecasts have gotten much better over the past 50 years, but even with Katrina, remember when Katrina hit back in 2005, the forecast for that storm actually changed as well. The Friday before it hit on a Monday morning, we once again thought it was going to go into the Florida Panhandle, and high pressure strengthened to the north of it, forced it back off to the west, and all of a sudden it was more of our problem. So let's take a comparison between Camille and Katrina here. Obviously, we talked about Camille being a Category 5 hurricane, 175 mile per hour winds at landfall. Katrina at one point was a Category 5 storm as well over the Gulf of Mexico, but it moved inland as a Category 3 storm with 125 mile per hour winds. Total deaths with Katrina, over 1,800, 238 of those were in Mississippi. With Camille, there were 259 deaths, 143 of those were on the Gulf Coast. We also talked about the storm surge, 24-foot storm surge with Camille. At the time, it was a record, but look at this, Katrina surpassed that. Now, the difference between Camille and Katrina was a very large storm, and it tracked a little bit farther to the west, closer to the Pearl River, which is kind of the border between Louisiana and Mississippi. So there was more of an impact in New Orleans with flooding there. Of course, we all know that. But with Camille, there wasn't very much of an impact flooding-wise in New Orleans. It was mostly a compact storm that affected the Mississippi coastline. Of course, later, as the storm slowed down, as it moved inland, there was flash flooding in the mid-Atlantic. And in terms of costliest storms, well, Katrina was #1 on the list, the costliest hurricane ever. Hurricane Camille, $1.42 billion in damage, but that's in 1969 dollars. Compare that to 2005 dollars and a little over $9 billion in damage. So, yeah, we've gotten much better with this, with forecasting this, with warning folks. And, of course, people do take storms like this seriously on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. And when we sound the alarm, of course, they know to get out of the way of a storm like this. So we have those evacuation routes where they turn the highways one way, and a lot of folks do their best to get out of there.
Yeah. Ken, you've been there a long time in Mississippi, been all over the state. Can you still see impacts from Camille 50 years later? And can you tell the difference between those and what Katrina did?
I'm not sure if we can really tell impacts from Camille. Certainly the Gulf Coast really built up actually after Camille. We actually had riverboat gambling passed in Mississippi back in the early 90s. And after that happened, we actually had a lot of casinos that were built offshore off the coastline. Well, Katrina really did change a lot of that. After that came through, those, of course, casinos were completely destroyed. And after that, the laws were really changed a lot. They passed some building codes where these buildings had to be wind and water resistant. They passed a code where they have to be so high up off the ground and they have to have an open foundation on piers. So I think we're a lot more prepared for a storm now, say after Katrina, than we were after Camille.
Ken, I'll finish up with this one. I talked about driving around, if you can see any difference. What about the people? I mean, do they still remember it? Obviously, we're talking some older people, but do they still remember Camille?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. If you're from Mississippi, Camille, again, was really the storm by which all other storms were judged by. And I grew up in Mississippi. I'm from here. And so we were always, every hurricane season that rolled around, we were always reminded of how bad Camille was and what a monster storm that was. Of course, it wasn't until Katrina came through that the next generation got a new Camille.
Wow. Ken South, thank you so much. You've been there forever. Next time you guys are down there, look for another fellow bearded meteorologist. Good to see another beard on a meteorologist on TV. He is at WJTV. He covers Jackson all the way down to Hattiesburg. So thank you to Ken South for sharing a perspective there. You know, Camille was one of only 4 Category 5 hurricanes to ever hit the United States. So we've got records that go all the way back to the 1800s. Okay, and we know how bad and strong Category 5. There have only been 4 of them to ever hit our contiguous 48 states. So there have been other Category 5s that have been just out in the middle of the ocean and haven't hit. But hitting as a Cat 5, there's been Camille in '69. The Labor Day hurricane, before we had a naming system back in 1935, that hit the Florida Keys. Michael, just a couple years ago, had 160-mile-per-hour winds. That came in the Florida Panhandle. And Andrew, back in 1992, hit the southeast coast just north of the Miami area. So it's interesting. All the hurricanes that have been around for all the years, only 4 Cat 5s have ever hit the United States. And look where they all are. I mean, they're all basically around Florida, right? So that is an interesting climatological statistic. But if anyone ever asks you if you want to wow your friends at the next party or have them run off and think you're too much of a weather nerd, how many Category 5 hurricanes have ever hit the United States? And the answer is 4. I want to take a second, as we do every week. We're going to go out into the Pacific Ocean. You know, the Pacific has been very busy this year. They've just had one storm that kind of fizzled out off the Baja coast there. It's almost nothing now. That was earlier this week. They're watching another system that's got some a little bit of circulation, an upper level low, some thunderstorm activity, a 40% chance of development. But here's what's interesting about the Pacific season so far. And I want to go to their name list. You know, we've only had 2 off our list. look how many they've had. They've already gone through 8 named storms. Now, their season it goes a little differently than ours here on the Atlantic side, but they've already made it through Henriette, and they've got Ivo and Juliet next. They've got a whole nother bank of names, obviously swayed a little more toward the Hawaiian and the Asian culture, while our names are more Americanized, Caribbean, Mexico. They've got a whole different set of names, and boy, they have had quite a busy season so far. One other thing about Camille, Ken showed this, and I'll show this as we get ready for our next guest, but the path did most of the devastation in and around the Gulf Coast, and I'll put that up for you real quick. But once it came inland, it took a pretty good right turn and came right over the mid-Atlantic, right over Virginia. And that leads us into our next guest. We will stay on the topic of Hurricane Camille because it made it over Virginia, and that's where we are looking live at right now. This is Sandbridge Beach in Virginia Beach. About 2 hours inland of this view is our next guest, John Bernier. He was with us earlier in the season. He is the chief meteorologist at WRIC in Richmond. John, we just talked to Ken in Mississippi about their impact from Hurricane Camille. You're going to talk about the impact for the Mid-Atlantic because a lot of people forget it did some damage up here, but you also have a great story about how Camille got its name. Let's start with that tonight.
Okay, you want to start with the name, how Camille got its name. All right, let's bring up Weather 2 behind me and talk about this. We go back to 1969, the National Hurricane Center. John Hope, Dr. John Hope, many of you remember him from the Weather Channel. He was one of the forecasters there. Well, the original name was supposed to be Carol. That was the original sea name, but there was a Carol in 1965. 1954, there was a terrible storm named Carol. Well, what was going on at that time was John Hope's daughter was graduating from high school. She was #1 in her class. She's now married to a former congressman in the state of Georgia, and she was doing a research project with the National Hurricane Center. And it so impressed the management there that they came to John and said, let's replace the name Carol with Camille. Camille in 1969 may be the only hurricane on record actually named for a specific person.
I did not know. You told me you had a great story, so I'm glad I do learn something new every day. But besides the name,
And by the way, the technology back then for tracking hurricanes, this was like the upgraded version, a map where you could use a dry erase pencil for it. That's what we use. Now, of course, it's all on computers for us here. Yeah, that's a whole nother thing we could get into is the technology 50 years ago and, how hard it was to track storms and how easy it is now. But like many storms that come up from the Gulf Coast and the Mid-Atlantic, Camille was a huge rainmaker. I mean, it caused a lot of problems from North Carolina up to Virginia, even points farther north. It did cause huge problems all the way up north. Let's go to the map. We're going to go to the wall, show you what's going on here. I pulled up the old-fashioned maps to show you, and we start on August 15th, so 50 years ago tomorrow, one of the reasons why it's my wife's birthday. We won't talk about how old she was back then. But right here, there was just a boundary to the northwest, and this is a situation we have seen that has led to interactions with tropical systems that have resulted in tremendous flooding. So, of course, Camille worked its way north. Here it comes towards landfall when it's going to drop down to 901 millibars, and there's the boundary that's weakening to the west, and then 2 days later it's up here over Tennessee, but this boundary is going to shift it eastward and bring it over Virginia on a straight west to east path over us. And this has been a situation where we have seen these boundaries steering tropical cyclones, hurricanes, strong tropical storms. We've had several events here in Virginia. Of course, Camille in 1969 we're going to talk about. Hurricane Floyd, 1969, affecting eastern North Carolina, east of you and southeastern Virginia, where the town of Franklin was basically underwater. Hurricane Gaston, the 15th anniversary of that is coming up here in 2 weeks. And of course, that dropped at the Science Museum of Virginia, which is right downtown, used to be the main train station. A foot of rainfall and created tremendous flooding in an area we're going to show you some pictures of flooding from here in Richmond. And then Hurricane Michael last year, it did the same thing as it came in. And we talk a lot about the wind factor there. Category 5 storm. It came up along a boundary in Virginia. We had tornadoes, we had terrible storms. But Farmville, Virginia, which is about an hour west of us, it's famous from the 1950s, desegregation case there, it's home of Longwood University. They had what we refer to as their Gaston. They had almost a foot of rainfall. Tremendous flooding suffered by Farmville out through there. So, of course, the storm came through. Here's the path it took, as you can see, sliding straight across Virginia, coming very close, just to the south of Richmond, and this was the heavy rainfall associated with it. This is an area up around Tappahannock and up around Fort A.P. Hill, where they used to have the big Boy Scout Jamboree. They had 8 inches of rain, but out in the mountains, because we have the influence of the mountains here, we had upwards of 2 feet of rain that fell in 12 hours. 2 feet of rain in 12 hours. Just think of how much that happens to be. So you're coming up, it's falling up against a mountain slope. Very hard to detect, because we mentioned we should talk about the technology. Remember, the very first radar system put in nationwide was the WSR-57. It was a C-band radar. That's all technical mumble-jumble stuff. There was one up in Patuxent River. There was one down in Norfolk. It could not, when you had very heavy rainfall, see past the heavy rain. So there was almost no information on how much rain was falling up here. And in Nelson and Amherst counties, we had as many people die in flash flooding as were killed by the storm making landfall along the coastline there. So this is a picture from up in Nelson County. These were the mudslides that took place, literally just hillsides being washed away. All that heavy rainfall turning the soil into soup and sending it rushing downhill. We had homes that were just swept away from their foundations there. Okay, you can see the trees fair and fine, but the homes just completely washed away. Along the Rockfish River in Nelson County, this is the Schuyler Dam, which had a power plant there, hydroelectric plant. That's gone, washed completely downstream. There was a bridge right here, completely gone. All that's left in the power plant is the chimney. Point this out to you. If you go out here in Nelson County, this is where the Walton Mountain Museum is. The television show The Waltons, set in the Jefferson County, Virginia, which there is no Jefferson County, Virginia, but John Boy, Grandpa, Mary Ellen. This is where Earl Hamner, who basically created the series, is from Nelson County in this area here. So that was all coming downhill, and of course, that all fed, the Rockfish River feeds right into the James River. That brings all that moisture and all that water down into our direction. In fact, from Waynesboro all the way down to Richmond, pretty much everybody was cut off here in the States. So these are pictures from Richmond, Virginia. If you've ever traveled through Richmond going I-95 northbound, there's I-95 right there. This is a section called Shockoe Bottom, and Shockoe Slip is on the other side. It's a restaurant and entertainment district right here. There's a great, great piece of place right over here underneath the railroad tracks. Okay, but this is the view. This is the Main Street Station, and that's the clock tower here. This is the flooding that was going on here. This was an area here where I've got pictures from Gaston. There is a farmer's market here, 17th Street, and there's a street sign right here. The water in 2004 up to the bottom of the street signs. Walk out to the street signs on the corner of your neighborhood and look to see where the road names are and see how high up they are above you. Shows you how much water was in there. And then, of course, this created all kinds of flooding here. This is the south side of the James River. This is the north side. And the bridge is going over. You can see the flooding that went through. This was the second worst flood recorded in Virginia as a result of this storm. Okay, another picture to show you this, another picture showing the areas around the railroad tracks all through. Richmond went through a span in 17 years where we had 3 tremendous floods on the James River. Camille, 1969, then Agnes in 1972, and then we went forward into 1985, what was the ghost of Hurricane Juan that went up through the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was the election week, the week Doug Wilder was elected lieutenant governor in Virginia. He eventually became governor in the early 1990s, late 1980s, early 1990s. That was the 3rd highest flood. After that was when they built the flood wall here, and the flood wall that May in 2004 contributed to some of that flooding in that area we showed you just a couple of moments ago. So tremendous flooding over us here. One of the issues with it, it was not well detected because it couldn't be seen on radar, but we've made tremendous advances in the technology since then with better radars. Doppler radar, folks, we talk about its use in tracking hurricanes. Its main use really flood prevention, which is actually a greater killer than hurricanes or tornadoes. Also, we've got what's called the iFlow system, which are automated rain gauges out in the mountains. We use those a lot to tell us about very heavy rainfall. But all in all, a very terrible situation that started 50 years ago for us here and affected us, even though we were actually far away from where the storm made landfall.
John, I want to ask you, what would happen today if that populated area in Virginia, because in 1969 there weren't as many people as there are today, what happened today if you guys got 2 feet of rain?
We would have a lot of problems. We have problems with flooding in some subdivisions. We've got a lot of areas that have expanded. We get a lot of situations with urbans and small stream flooding, and we even had last year in a couple of the events, we had an event last year that dropped out at the airport, almost 6 inches of rain in a span of 2 hours. We do get a lot of urbanized flooding here, and you are correct, population has exploded in Virginia. About this time when this occurred, Chesterfield County, which is that side of the river, it's where I used to live, where I lived for 30 years before I moved north of the river, had about 70,000 in population. It's knocking on 400,000 now. So obviously it has grown tremendously. The other big issue we've had with all of this flooding here, especially here, there are other pictures. You can see the wastewater treatment plant for the city of Richmond flooded out, which of course creates problems downstream with, of course, untreated water going through. So yes, urban flooding, flash flooding, it is an issue with urbanization because the ground topography is changing as a result of that, so it's affecting the drainage systems. It's a problem in all the growing areas of the Southeast.
Yeah, John, I'll finish with this. I'll just kind of let you, you've seen a lot and you're a good student of meteorology and of history. I mean, let's mention the technology. I mean, how different would it be today if we were tracking another Category 5 hurricane coming up the Gulf and then making a right turn like that?
Well, first of all, we have to remember, we go back to 1969. If you go look at the whole history, you have no-name storms in 1969 because we were still not getting very well at detecting these things. Now, these things are like the World Series, okay? You could go up by the Cabo Verde Islands and we're watching this thing for days and days and days coming our way. Yeah. So we know it's coming. There are still inaccuracies where it's going to make landfall. Big inaccuracies on the strength of storms, how they rapidly strengthen or they, Michael, an example just last year of how it just exploded in its strength and went through. We know better when things are coming. Now, we need to become more precise on the actual events, where the rain field is going to be. Harvey. Okay, we go back to Harvey and affected down in Houston. There was actually very good modeling on how much rain there was going to be there. Houston's issues, the urbanization of Houston, all that natural drainage area was gone. Okay, and that's why you had the flooding through all those subdivisions there. The wind and the coastal issues are still, the most dramatic that we see, but really it's the inland flooding, the inland flooding, the inland flooding that's the problem. And as you and I know, floodwaters are the waters that keep destroying because what gets somebody's house 50 miles up the river can come down and get yours. Yeah,
exactly right. I think the coast gets all the news attention, but most of the damage is done inland, and unfortunately most of the lives are taken there too. John, good stuff tonight. Thank you for the lessons on Camille and what's going up in the Mid-Atlantic for a massive hurricane that destroyed the Gulf Coast, but also it left a lot of problems for the East Coast as well. John Bernier is at WRIC up in Richmond. Next time you're in his neck of the woods, turn him on, and I want to thank him and Ken South down in Mississippi. Great show tonight. A lot of good content when we don't have anything going on in the Atlantic. Let's hope that continues. And when something does pop up, we will be here to help get you through it. Remember, we are here every week at 8 o'clock on your local station and your website. Of course, we generate from Raleigh, North Carolina. My name is Wes Hohenstein. I want to thank you for being part of our show tonight. We will see you next week at 8 o'clock right here on CBS 17 for Eye of the Storm.